So good morning, everybody. Thank you, Philippe and Brett, for inviting me. It starts off. I try to wake me up, and hopefully it works within half an hour. So I'm going to talk to you about symbiotic microbiota and the impact of the symbiotes on the development of immunity in the gut. And I'm going to focus on pro-inflammatory immunity and try to make the case that pro-inflammatory immunity is not only good to make autoimmune disease, but also to keep homeostasis. For instance, I'm going to develop this in the gut. So I may not need to put this slide on here, but no, just a reminder that Pasteur and Koch showed that microbes can be vectors of death. And that's probably the prevalent view of the lay people. I challenge you to go on the street and ask people what they think of microbes. I think there would be a huge majority of people thinking that microbes are vectors of disease and potentially death. But it's not only lay people. There is this pervasive view also in immunologists and maybe microbiologists that when the immune system sees a microbe, it's because it sees pathogen. That is, whenever the immune system reacts, it reacts to eliminate the bug it sees. And we see oftentimes that the determinants which are recognized on microbes by the immune system, by innate receptors, we see that these are generally called pathogen-associated molecular patterns. A few years later at Pasteur, Metchnikov was concerned with his advanced aging, and he was fascinated by people in Bulgaria who apparently lived longer than the mean Europeans, and these people apparently consumed fermented milk product. Don't ask me the name in Bulgarian, I can't remember. But the point is this product was fermented by Lactobacillus bulgaricus, shown here. And the notion that bacteria can also be agent of goods was developed in a book by Ilya Metchnikov, and he was convinced that we are potentially immortal, but environment kills us, and in his case it was proteolytic bacteria in the gut, namely Clostridia, and these kind of lactobacilli would fight off these bad bacteria and prolong our life. So the term probiotic was coined much later, in the 50s, to contrast with antibiotics. So this is the same painter than before, Peter Bruegel, to illustrate that most of the time we don't deal with microbes which are pathogens or would drive us to death. Most of the time we deal with myriads of microbes which we don't actually consciously acknowledge, which might do nothing to us, which might do something, but something very mild we don't even see or feel. So this is to acknowledge the work of Margaret McFarlane Guy. She's probably the first one who coined the term microbe-associated molecular patterns, to acknowledge the fact that, again, most of the time what our innate receptors see are actually just determinants on microbes, and this does not determine that these microbes are pathogens. We discussed in this review this notion that we try to discuss and depart from the bimodal view of microbiology and immunology, and we like to classify microbes as mutualists or pathogens, but most of the microbes are somewhere in between. They may be good, they may be bad, and worse, one specific microbe can be a mutualist in one context, and if that context changes because you become, for example, immunosuppressed, then the same mutualist or the same microbe can turn into a deadly pathogen. We also discussed this bimodal view of immunology. We also like to classify immunology as regulatory or inflammatory, and it's clear that the immune system comes in many blends, and this is, in my view, because microbes come in many blends, and we have many different weapons to establish equilibrium with these microbes. And I'm going to do the case that inflammation can also be one of these tools, not just to kill microbes, but to establish homeostasis. So this is a review written by Jim DeSanto and Philippe Sansonetti some time ago, where they discuss this notion, actually first coined by Metchnikoff, of physiologic inflammation. That is, an immune reaction which is not aimed at killing microbes, but actually participates in establishing homeostasis. And we have heard many talks yesterday in that sense. So physiologic inflammation, for instance, in the gut, would be the one which promotes the barrier effects maintained by the mucus, maintained by things like Th2, Tregs, TGF-beta, etc. Now, when this barrier is breached, you have to come up with a mean to eradicate the breaches, and they coined here the notion of pathological inflammation. That is the one which you need to face off the invaders. So in this discussion, it was really, homeostasis on one side and pathology on the other side. I would argue here that this system is also in place at steady state. For instance, if you examine the gut, mouse or man, it's the site to have the highest proportion of pro-inflammatory immunity, being Th1. I'm going to drive more into Th17/22 immunity. It's in the gut that in a mouse which is not apparently sick, or even in a human which appears to be okay, you have from 5 to 10% of cells which you like to see as very pro-inflammatory. So just a few points to remind you basics about type 17/22 immunity. IL-17 has been cloned, I think, 19 or 20 years ago from activated T cells. It came back to fame in 2003 in this paper where it was shown that it was not IL-12 and type 1 immunity which was driving autoimmune encephalomyelitis in mice, but rather IL-23, and the confusion came because the two cytokines share a common subunit. So it was IL-23 rather than IL-12 that was driving autoimmunity. And then Kua showed later that, and others showed that IL-23 was driving the generation of these so-called Th17 cells producing IL-17. So from there was you can witness this big fashion about type 17 immunity. Nonetheless, it cannot be that evolution has kept such a pathway just to make autoimmune disease. And J. Coles reminds us of probably the natural function of type 17 immunity, that is to fight off extracellular microbes at mucosal surfaces. So let me just do a few points about SFBs, which we have heard yesterday. First, it's a beautiful bacteria. This is a fish staining of the ileum of the mouse, and I didn't cheat. We just did a universal fish staining for 16S rDNA, and you can see these nice spaghettis or hairs around the villi of the intestine. I think we have seen that yesterday too. They are called segmentous filamentous bacteria because that's what they do, and they proliferate. They do these filaments, and they really stick into the epithelial cells. And when you do this staining, you realize that it's a very special bacteria because it establishes, it goes into a very special niche that is underneath the mucus, which is not stained here. It's probably one of the few, at least well visible, commensal symbiotes which can bind direct to the epithelial cells. So Nadine showed already yesterday that contrary, I think, to what we like to think, that SFB is the bacteria which is inducing type 17 immunity, it actually induces all type of T helper cells, and I see that more generally as a general inducer of T cell differentiation. Just a few PCRs we did in the lab. These are germ-free mice who have monocolonized with SFB and a number of ASF strains, and the control is somewhere here in white, which is germ-free mice, and you have different colors, but focus on the yellow, which is SFB, and you can just appreciate how good, how best it is, how it outbests the other strains. And also the second point is that IL-17 is here, but you have interferon gamma, you have 6CL9, you have another a bunch of other chemokines. By no means this is extensive. You also have IL-27, which is inhibiting the type 17 immunity. So it is not, in my view, the bug-inducing type 17. It's a general inducer of T-cell differentiation, and that's how we see it, and that's how we understand that it's present. We might have developed the notion that it's potentially a dangerous bug because it induces pro-inflammatory immunity. I see that rather as a vaccine. That is, it is a bug which does, like a pathogen, it crosses the mucus, it binds to the epithelial cells, but that's it. It doesn't go the next step to invade the lamina propria. So it's perfect for the host because it acts as if it would be a pathogen, but not quite. And what you need best to increase the threshold, the alertness of the immune system. So some people have called these SFBs pathobionts, which is nice in terms of a bug, which is a symbiote acting like a pathogen but not being one. Okay, just let me mention this paper and the next one. This paper, Dan Mattis and Christophe Benoit, is a nice paper showing that SFB induces Th17 and arthritis. What I think is a little bit misleading in the title that it doesn't mention that it's context dependent. Going back to the notion I discussed at the very beginning, SFB in our mice is okay. The mice don't suffer of autoimmunity. It does pose a problem in a very specific context, and the context used in that paper is a germ-free mouse which is genetically predisposed to develop arthritis, which is a KBN mouse. So again, the point is that a symbiote can become a pathogen in a specific context. And in this next paper, I enjoy the honesty expressed in the title, which is that, for instance, this Bactéries can be a pathogen, but it's host genotype specific, and it's a mouse model of autoimmunity. I think this is a very nice paper showing that even a Bactéries, which is generally recognized as a good mutualist, can become a pathogen. But again, what matters is the context. And of course, we are full of symbiotes, being bacteria, viruses, or fungi. If we become immunosuppressed, then we might have troubles with these guys. So let me go into type 17/22 immunity, and just to remind you that this nuclear receptor, Rho gamma T, is a transcription factor which is necessary to develop type 17 cells. So how bad is type 17/22 pro-inflammatory immunity? We did very simple experiments. That is, now we have a wild-type mouse on the left and the Rho gamma T knockout, which we subjected to low dose of DSS. So DSS pokes holes in mucus and epithelium of the gut, and so that the commensals are going to invade the host, and there is inflammation. The wild type can still cope with it, but you can see that Rho gamma T knockouts have a problem, which is kind of counterintuitive because now we miss this pro-inflammatory immunity, and you might expect that actually it goes better. Actually, it goes worse. The mice tend to lose weight pretty fast. The colitis score is up, and actually, what happens now when you look at IgG in the blood, what happens is that now you lose efficient containment of this microbiota in the gut. And what we could not see easily bacteria inside, but what we did was to apply a protocol published by Andrew, where now you titrate IgG in the blood specific for commensals. So you take bacteria from the gut and you do FACS with IgGs from the blood, and you can see in the wild type you cannot find any reactivity to symbionts from the gut, but now you look in the wild type, now you can see, showing that you have a leakage, you have lost containment. But the mouse is still okay if you don't challenge it. And the reason why it's okay, it's because it has a plan B. The plan B is we have lost containments now in periphery, we do more B cells, and this is just to show you that the B cell compartment here in the gut is tremendously increased. ARD is the enzyme needed to make gene switch and affinity maturation, so it's hugely increased. Now you find IgG, very atypically, you find IgG in the lamella propria of the gut. And this is a driver of pathology, which is not driven by 17 or interferon gamma. This is driven by B cells, and actually if you block Fc receptors with intravenous IgGs, then you substantially or significantly decrease pathology. So you can also decrease pathology by transferring cells, which include these pro-inflammatory cells, and again, you decrease the pathology. So the point I want to do here is first that type 17 and 22 immunity is, in our view, at homeostasis, involved in containment of the microbiota in the gut, first. And second, immunopathology can come from every corner. It can come from type 17 immunity, can come from type 1, can come from type 2. So when these different forces of immunity are in a state of imbalance, then you might develop immunopathology. And this is one case here which has been described some time ago, that B cells as well can drive a pathology in the gut. So the take-home message is that the disbalance in the immune forces can lead to pathology. So what is in type 17 immunity? We have seen the T cells to 17 cells yesterday. So just to present to you the collection of T cells we know of, and of course, as you know, there are many more. Just put some here: Th1, Th2, Tregs. We know about Th1, Th17, Th22, and I'm sure that in a decade from now we're gonna be at stage 55. This is adaptive immunity. And also to remind you that this transcription factor, rho gamma T, is necessary to drive the differentiation of Th17 and Th22 cells. So since a number of years, there's been this description of innate lymphoid cells. We know one type of innate lymphoid cells since some time, the NK cells, and what the NK cells do in terms of cytokine production is pretty much the same as what the Th1 cells do. The difference is that they don't have, well, maybe I should be careful, they don't have an antigen receptor, they don't necessarily convey memory. So, but what they do is already to orchestrate very fast, within 1 hour, they react to a situation which asks for type 1 immunity. They are there in place, they orchestrate the type 1 immunity, and when the T cells come in, everything is already set. What now the T cells add to the mix is antigen specificity and therefore memory. So since 2 years, we know about the neocytes. New has nothing to do with naked. It's just the 13th letter of the Greek alphabet, and neocytes do loads of IL-13 when stimulated, and actually they are the mirror image of Th2 cells. We haven't found ILC regs yet, but I'm sure it's a matter of time. ILC17 have been nicely described by Fiona in model of colitis. NK22 cells, I'm coming to these cells right now, and both cells, at least in mouse, need rho gamma T to differentiate. And this is top secret Pasteur program. So let me go into this rho gamma T positive ILCs, that is those conveying type 17 and 22 immunity. The story started with LTI cells. They've been first, which is lymphoid tissue inducer cells, which have been published some time ago. Don't ask me the name, it was an European Journal of Immunology paper, I can't remember. And then better described by Rena Möbius at the end of the 90s. And these cells are quite extraordinary. They only exist probably in mammals. These cells are the only lymphoid cells found during the secondary development in a mouse. And what they do is to recapitulate an inflammation in the sterile, or what we think to be a sterile environment in the fetus. So they're going to create an inflammatory loci at sites where it is programmed to develop a lymphoid tissue. So these cells are going to be recruited at these sites here. For example, here in the mesentery, they're going to cluster, they're going to interact with the stroma cells, they're going to induce the stroma cells to express a number of things, like IKM1, VKM1, which are adhesion molecules, and as well as chemokines. And all these features are the features you can find in an inflammatory loci in the adult. So these cells, just to recapitulate what you would do fighting off, for example, an infection or an injury. So, and then with time, you will have B cells and T cells collected as during inflammation, and you will develop a lymph node or pass patch. And a lymph node or pass patch is nothing else than a stabilized inflammation. And the contrary is true too. Any inflammation you have during adulthood, which gets chronic, tends to develop a lymphoid tissue. So these LTI cells cluster also in the gut after birth. Here you have a pass patch. Here you have this network of lymphoid tissues, and this is a kind of there's a catalog of different lymphoid tissues. One is the cryptopatch, which is basically a cluster of LTI cells, and then on the other extreme you have these isolated lymphoid follicles, which is nothing else than a B cell follicle, which can mature B cells producing antibodies. And what we showed is that contrary to the fetus, where now the LTI cells are automatically performing, these cells are kind of blocked in a status, and it's deblocked by the incoming microbiota. And epithelial cells sense this incoming microbiota. It sends peptide glycans, which is shed off by microbiota, and this induces a cascade of events, which leads to the release of defensins, being actually also chemokines, and this activates the pathway to produce these ILFs. And there's a negative feedback loop, that is because these are going to produce B cells making IgA, and this blocks the pathway. So the more bacteria you have, the more you induce, but actually the more they block themselves. So 2-3 years ago, there were a flurry of papers describing this NK-like, just NK-like, they have nothing to do with NK cells, but they express a few NK markers like this one, NKp46 in the mouse, and these cells produce a lot of IL-22. So just a reminder, what is IL-22? It's not this one. If you go on Wikipedia, you put IL-22, you find this Soviet Cold War bomber. It's not this. It's rather this. IL-22 is a very efficient inducer of epithelial defense. It induces epithelial cells to produce proteins which are targeting bacteria such as REG3 proteins. What it also does is to be anti-apoptotic. It induces BCL2 expression of epithelial cells and counters the apoptosis. So what we did was to examine who does produce IL-22 in the gut, and we used here a reporter for ROGAMA T, under the report of GFP, and co-stain for IL-22, and here you can appreciate that the vast majority of the cells, as expected, producing IL-22 are actually expressing this ROGAMA T transcription factor. Now, if you stain for CD4 and T cells, less expected was that actually the majority of cells producing 22 were not T cells here, but rather innate lymphoid cells. And also unexpected now, if you look into germ-free mice, you lose the T cells because the T cells react to something, but now you keep the ILCs. So looking closer at what these ILCs were, of course, homology is always more complex. We have a number of populations, but basically there are two types. One is the one I just described to you, which is the LTI cells, which is prevalent before birth, and then after birth they kind of drop and cluster in cryptopatches in the gut. But you have this vast expansion of the other types of ILCs I mentioned in these different papers. So seeing that, it looks like obvious that the microbiota has something to do with it. So we looked into germ-free mice, and now if you compare here in gray SPF mice to germ-free mice, you can see that, and this we know since 30 years, that in germ-free mouse you lose you have a tenfold decrease in the number of T cells in the gut. Now, if you focus on GFP positive cells, which are basically Th17 cells, you have this vast decrease, which is a log scale here of the Th17 cells, which we also know. What was unexpected, though, was that there is absolutely no impact on the development of these innate lymphoid cells. So this remodeling or this reshuffling of these populations of ILCs is not induced by microbiota, but actually seems to preempt microbiota. A microbiota has another impact on these cells, and this became clear when we looked at the activity of these cells. They were actually maximal before birth. Don't ask me why they do IL-22 before birth. We don't know. But now, if you look before weaning, it's still high. After weaning, it drops substantially. It's also true for IL-17. IL-17 is highest in the fetus. Again, don't ask me what does IL-17 in the fetus. I don't know. But again, it drops, and it's virtually undetected after weaning. So we reasoned maybe weaning has something to do. This drop after weaning has something to do with the colonizing microbiota. So we compared SPF to germ-free mice, and this is the low level of IL-22 produced in the adult ILCs. Now, if you compare to germ-free mice, there is a total de-repression of the activity of ILCs. So it seems that even though the dynamic, the structure of the population is preempting the colonization of the gut by microbiota, their function is nevertheless repressed by microbiota. And actually the T cell suggests the opposite. The T cell has this IL-22 producing activity in the SPF mice, but it drops in the absence of microbiota. So I'm not going to go into too much detail, but just to tell you that we know more or less how it works. We have looked at IL-25. IL-25 has been known to block type 17 immunity. So we looked naturally at 25, and 25 actually needs microbiota to be induced in the epithelial cells, to be induced by the epithelial cells, and it goes up after weaning. Now, if you look in 25 knockouts, the number of ILCs goes up. If we also titrate or stain for IL-22, it goes up in the 25 knockouts. If we inject 25, it represses. So it looks pretty straightforward. What was less straightforward is that these raw gamma ILCs don't express the receptor for 25. It's expressed actually by another cell population, which is the dendritic cells around these cryptopatches. So what I didn't show you before is that these clusters of LTI cells, of ILCs, are surrounded by a shell of dendritic cells. And I told you that before that the function of lymphoid tissue inducing of the LTI cells is not automatic as in the fetus. You need to deblock this function by the incoming microbiota. So here they have a different function. They still they surround the ILCs, and now the microbiota induces 25 production by the epithelial cells, which sense them. I don't know how. And 25 then acts on the dendritic cells in the shell, and the shell represses the function of the ILCs. Now, if you deconstruct these structures, because you knock out chemokine receptors such as CCR6, which is important in structuration of the gut immune system, then you lose this control. So just to recapitulate what I just said. So before birth, you have mostly these LTI cells which are involved in inducing microinflammation in the fetus, which ends up making lymphoid tissues. After birth, the major event is the colonization of the gut by symbionts, and these cells now are going to cluster in the cryptopatches and have a role in homeostasis. Now we have the expansion of the other type of ILCs, which are more free forms. They're not clustered, they're more free, and in our view, this suits maybe better a role into directly interacting with epithelial cells and inducing directly by virtue of IL-22, namely epithelial defenses. And very important point, this system in terms of development dynamics does not adapt but rather preempt microbial colonization. So in a more general context, you have you have these. You have these guys, these pro-inflammatory IL-6s, which are programmed to express high levels of IL-22, and this is probably a way to set a selection threshold in the gut. There are many ways to select the incoming bacteria. This is probably one. So now the bacteria come in, and of course, there's going to be a crosstalk. And one of the ways for the microbiota to crosstalk with this system is by virtue of recognition by the epithelial cells and secretion of IL-25, which blocks these IL-6s. Now, in parallel, might sound paradoxical, but now the T cells producing the same cytokines are induced. The more microbiota you have, the more T cells producing 17 and 22 you're going to generate. So it sounds like antinomic, and you just wonder how these two systems are regulated. We are studying this. What you know is that they probably occupy a similar niche. If you remove the T cells, then the IL-6s go up. So what we would like to develop in the future is our notion, coming back to the fact that the IL-6s are the prime responder of an infection or injury locus, is that the IL-6s may be the chef d'orchestre, and when the T cells come in, the nature of the game is already played, and then you can make adaptive immunity. So what if you could develop adjuvants or stuff which manipulates the right IL-6s to get then the right types of adaptive immunity in developing vaccines for mucosa or else. Okay, so that is it. So the people having done this work, Jaida was a former PhD student in the lab. She did the work on the cryptopatches. Matthias Loschner and Kaspar Onmacht did the work on colitis induced in Rogamatine knockout's. Shinichiro Osawa, now in Tokyo, together with Marie Cherry, did the work on IL-6s. Laura Presley and Ruth Marcus are working on the nature and the role of microbiota on pro-inflammatory immunity, and Lucette and Sophie are the technicians helping us in many, many ways. So collaborations have been with Marion Bérard, who is commanding the platform of neurobiology at Pasteur. We have worked a lot with Ivo Gombetz-Boneka, who is our molecular microbiologist. I don't know nothing, or now I know a little bit more about bacteria, but Philippe and Ivo teach me, I think, the right things, a lot of things. We collaborated with Jim DeSanto on the IL-6s. This was done also in collaboration with Nadine, with Dan Kua on IL-25, with Jeff Browning, LT beta receptor, etc. And well, thank you very much.